We're going to move on now to Carl Bolster and Barrett Wessel, who are at the USDA. Carl's a research hydrologist and has been doing a lot of work on phosphorus transport in watersheds. And he's been joined more recently by a new postdoctoral researcher, Barrett Wessel, who's going to join him in advancing this work. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen then, Carl, and you'll have a chance to get started. So welcome and thank you for joining the Phosphorus Forum.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and just thank the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance for inviting us. There's a caveat in this, is when we initially planned this, we thought we'd be further along in this project than we currently are for various reasons. COVID not being the least of them. But I'm going to talk today briefly about a project we're looking at, the field scale modeling of phosphorus loss from agricultural fields within the Western Lake Erie Basin using the Apple model. And I'm going to be joined, Barrett is my postdoc who has been funded in part by OCP North America to work on this project. And Kevin King has provided the data, and we're going to be using his sites and his postdoc, the data from his sites in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And we'll be also working with Vinayak Shedeker, who is his postdoc. So I want to introduce you first, before I get into the research, to our transport modeling group. So here you see listed the steering committee and the members. We're a relatively diverse group, both from academic institutions and government agencies. And we are interested in quite a range of topics related to phosphorus modeling. And this is just a partial list. One of the things that several of us are looking into is phosphorus modeling within the Western Lake Erie Basin. And I guess before I go there, I just want to reiterate Matt's invitation earlier. If those of you who will be attending the Tri-Society meetings, that we'll be having a symposium there. And again, if any of this stuff looks interesting to you, or these topics, and you would like to maybe collaborate or get someone to help advise you, I would suggest that you contact Matt, who could put you into contact with the right person on our group. So as I said before, so many of us are working at phosphorus modeling within the Western Lake Erie Basin, using various models for various reasons, including using watershed models to inform policy decisions, developing decision support tools such as phosphorus index. Also, it's becoming more important, or just recognized as being something we need to do a better job at, is understanding the role of legacy P on phosphorus concentrations in the water body of concern, and also including in-stream processes, and using our models to evaluate how well stacked BMPs can do to evaluate just the effectiveness of those BMPs on water quality. So with that, I'm going to pass this off to Barrett, and he's going to talk a little bit about Western Lake Erie Basin. Yeah.
Yep, Western Lake Erie Basin, or WLEB, as we like to call it sometimes, is a particularly challenging landscape from the perspective of managing phosphorus. There's some unique environmental problems here that link back to geologic history that I'm just going to give a little explanation of. It's a region mostly in Northwest Ohio. You can see on the map here, it extends into Indiana and Michigan as well. About 11,900 square miles that drains into Lake Erie and causes some problems in Lake Erie, particularly the western half of the lake. The dominant land use is cultivated cropland. About 73% of the land within the WLEB is cultivated cropland in corn, soy, and wheat rotation dominantly. There's a little bit of grazing. There's some other cover crops used, but these are really what are grown here. And like I mentioned, the soils here are particularly problematic for a couple of reasons. Next slide, please. They're very poorly drained. The problem is that the geology here is that this part of the country has been glaciated several times. And it's also been covered by a much larger version of Lake Erie in the distant past during those periods of glaciation. And the result is that the soils here are derived from a material we call glacial till, and also from fine textured lake sediments. And so glacial till is this material that is bulldozed as glaciers move across the landscape. Think about a block of ice several hundred feet thick, bulldozing the surface of the land and rolling over that material and crushing it and squeezing out all the pore space, and it results in this dense material, denser than any plow pan you've seen, that's not very permeable to water. Similarly, the areas that were covered by the larger version of Lake Erie deposited fine textured lake sediments, silt and clay, and that material doesn't have a lot of space between the particles like loamy soils or sandy soils do. And so again, you've got very low hydraulic conductivity. The water that falls onto this landscape doesn't flow through it very effectively. It's very low elevation, very little slope. Again, that results from this sort of geologic history of having had most of the topography wiped out. And the result of this is that it really shrinks the growing season and the rooting depth of the plants that you can grow here. The soils are really wet. The water doesn't go anywhere. It's wet in the spring. It's hard to get out onto the land and do anything. And then it can get pretty wet towards the end of the year as well. And this can cause a lot of runoff issues. Next slide, please. So the runoff, I'm not going to spend too much time on. I'm sure everybody on this call knows that runoff is a problem. It drives erosion. It carries sediment and sediment-bound phosphorus in particular, but also dissolved phosphorus. Runoff as a source of phosphorus to water bodies was long assumed to represent the majority or maybe all of the phosphorus coming off of a landscape, and subsurface flow, as a rule, not just in the WLEB, was thought to be negligible or maybe even no phosphorus coming off. I'll show you on some following slides that may not be the case. And of course, surface runoff has been decreased in the Western Lake Erie Basin due to conservation tillage and no-till practices over the past several decades, which have done a lot to reduce the amount of sediment coming off, as well as subsurface drainage that's been installed over a longer period of time. Next slide, please. And so this drainage really drives eutrophication. The subsurface drainage that's been installed is really intense across this landscape because of those poorly drained soils. About half of them have been tile drained over the last 150 years, where these subsurface drains have been installed that route water into a variety of streams and ditches that then carry it into Lake Erie. And the problem here is that this can really short circuit the hydrology. So if you've got water that lands on a soil surface and it flows through, the soil provides some treatment, but when there are tile drains and when there are cracks and a lot of structure in the soil, water can flow preferentially right through those cracks and those large pores into the tile drains and out into the surface waters without going through really any treatment at all, by passing through the rest of the soil matrix. It just, water falls on the surface, it takes particulate and dissolved high phosphorus concentrations through those cracks into the tiles and straight out where it can cause problems. And some studies now in Western Lake Erie Basin and other places have shown that, in fact, this tile drainage can carry more than half of the phosphorus coming off these fields, more than the surface runoff. And so it is a major part of this equation, and that drives harmful algal blooms that impact water quality for the millions of people that depend on it in Lake Erie. Next slide. And so we're faced with sort of a balancing act that's kind of unique in this landscape. The first one is something that's not so unique. It's something that people have been dealing with for a long time, and that's the balance between agricultural production, what the farmers want and the food that people need, and water quality, which isn't just used for recreation and fisheries, but particularly freshwater sources like Lake Erie provide fresh water to a lot of the cities and the millions of people that live along the edge of the lake. And so these are two vital natural resources that are sort of in tension with one another at times, because this is one of the most productive agricultural regions in the country. And of course, all these people depend on the fresh water. And then the other issue is one that's arisen more recently as no-till practices and conservation tillage have become popular, particularly in Ohio over the past 20 to 30 years. There's this tension between soil health and phosphorus management, because as you improve the soil health and reduce the amount of tillage, you increase the organic carbon and the residue and all these good things about the soil surface, but you will also increase the soil structure and the amount of cracking in the soil. And that actually leads to an intensification of this subsurface phosphorus loss problem. In addition, it prevents mixing of phosphorus into the soil surface through tillage. And so even though you've got less water running off of the surface, the water that does run off may in fact have higher concentrations of phosphorus, because the phosphorus that has been applied to these fields doesn't get worked into the soil through that regular tillage. And so this raises questions about what the proper role of tillage is in these environments. Is no-till really the best thing? And is there some level of tillage or type of tillage that's appropriate to help manage this problem of phosphorus loss while still getting some of the benefits of soil health? So where do we find this optimum management scenario? And these are complex issues, and so we need really good data to do good science here. Next slide, please. And so we have some collaborators, Kevin and Vinayak, introduced on the first slide there, who maintain this edge of field network in the western Lake Erie Basin, part of Ohio. There are 40 paired sites at 20 farms. Now that number changes occasionally as farms are added or lost from the study. But the goal is to maintain multi-year monitoring of a number of paired sites and to look at the surface runoff and the tile water, which is a big benefit of having tile drains. You can't do this in a ditched landscape because ditches mix the surface and subsurface runoff. But when you've got tiles and you can sample that water directly, you can actually distinguish the influence of these two different flows on the issue. And you can use this before-after control impact experimental design, this BACI design, where you have these paired fields, you monitor them both through an entire crop rotation, and then you introduce some intervention in one of them and continue to monitor them both. And so that allows you to distinguish the effect of the intervention, be it tillage or nutrient management through fertilizer practices or something of that sort, and also changes through time. So it allows you to sort of account for the influence of weather, and it's a very powerful data set that allows some advanced analyses. Next slide, please. And so this is just an image of what's going on the edge of these fields. You can see in picture A here in the upper left, the solar powered station. Solar power is important. A lot of these data sets are very spotty, and so we're trying to get pretty cohesive data sets, pretty complete data sets throughout the year here, and this is something that has been accomplished fairly well. You see in picture B here an H flume capturing and measuring the water that comes off of the soil surface, and picture C here, compound weir and a tile outlet, again measuring not just the quantity of water coming through, but taking subsamples of that so that concentrations can be measured and loads can be calculated. Next slide, please. And so this data really drives models. The goal here is to make field scale recommendations to address regional issues. And the fact is that it's just not practical to put this type of monitoring equipment on every field. It would be astronomically expensive, right? And so we need to monitor a handful of representative fields, develop and improve these models, learn some lessons from that, and then apply those lessons to unmonitored fields. And those models need to be relatively user-friendly and need to be able to be run on available data if they're going to be widely adopted. There's a lot of great models out there that are very complex and that your average extension agent or consultant might not necessarily have the skill set to use, even if they can go through a short training. And so our goal is to develop and work on models that take data that's relatively available, that farmers already keep in their records, and that are not so complex that you can't get them in the hands of extension agents and potentially even motivated farmers and certainly consultants who'd like to utilize them. And with that, I'll hand it back to Carl to tell you a bit more about the models specifically.
Yeah, all right, thanks, Barrett. All right, that did not advance. Okay, so just a brief overview of models we talked about earlier. John did a good job, and I find that very interesting. You know, this kind of flows nicely from his talk. We have to recognize one thing, that a model is a simplification of reality. Sometimes we ask our models to do too much. Many different models exist. There have been several studies who, in the Western Lake Erie Basin at the watershed scale, some of those studies have been done by the people in our transport modeling group. And the different models exist because there's sometimes different perceptions of the important processes involved, you know, different time and spatial scales, whether it's daily, annual, spatial scale, you know, field scale up to the watershed. Then you can have kind of a range of empirical to process-based, you know, is it just kind of statistical correlations, or are you trying to incorporate the actual physics and chemistry involved? Now, there's no single model that's always the best to use in any given situation. It's really going to depend on several factors, including the data that are available, the goals of the modeling effort, and sometimes we forget about this, the experience of the person who's doing the modeling. We just tend to gravitate towards the models that we're comfortable with. And so, unfortunately, sometimes that means a square peg in a round hole. So, oftentimes when you're presenting your results from your model results, there's a range I've found of trust or acceptance of the results and the modeler themselves. You have kind of the one extreme, blind faith. This is what my model said. I don't even need data to validate it. It just, I know my model's so great. And, you'll see that when people present 3 or 4 significant digits in their model predictions with no uncertainty bounds. And then on the other side, you have the cynic who understands that models are imperfect and thus says, well, they're of no value and just discards the results, and they want to see actual data. But as was mentioned in the previous talk, we can't collect all the data we need. I argue for the skeptical believer, and that is, kind of to quote George Box, is all models are wrong, but some are useful. When properly used, recognizing the limitations, understanding the model assumptions, that the models can provide us good information to make important decisions on, but that requires the model to be tested. All right, so what we're looking at is to evaluate the annual P-loss estimator model that was developed by Pete Vadas at ARS, and to look at field scale loss in Western Lake Erie Basin. It's an annual time step model. It only requires a handful of parameters. Now, it does not calculate runoff and erosion, so that has to be calculated separately. And then compare those results with a daily, more complex time step model, such as TBET or Surfos. And one thing that I tend to stress in my talks is the need for incorporating uncertainty analysis in our model evaluation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then if we can demonstrate that the model is doing a pretty good job on these fields, then we can use it to simulate some different management practices. So in a previous study, looking at field scale loss throughout about a dozen sites in the South, we looked at comparing Apple with the Texas Best Management Evaluation Tool, which is essentially, it's a daily time step model, and it's basically the SWAT model developed or utilized at the field scale. And as you can see here, I think, so these are the model predictions for the 2 models, a strong correlation between the 2. But if you notice here, these kind of the residuals is the Apple model tended to overpredict phosphorus loss compared to TBET in all the sites. And that's primarily because the differences in how Apple calculates phosphorus loss from surface applied manures compared to TBET. I will note that we use the same runoff and erosion values that TBET used. So all we're looking at is differences in how they handle the actual phosphorus loss. Now, if you look at the actual runoff data, you can see that the much simpler model, does just as good generally or slightly better than the more complex TBET model. However, if you look at this and recognize that these are log scale, both of them leave a bit to be desired. There's a general trend, but there's still a lot of unexplained variability. So now, what about model uncertainties? So oftentimes we'll see something like this. Someone will present their observed versus predicted and a one-to-one line, and a goodness of fit statistic and see how far off that one-to-one line it is. In reality, we should be looking at something like this. As you'll see that there's uncertainties in both the predicted and the observed. And I really argue that we need to be more forward with that, acknowledge that. Why do we not calculate that? Oftentimes, they are hard to calculate. There are many sources of uncertainties. Which ones do you focus on? But also I think another level is how do you communicate that to a lay audience without undermining the credibility of your model? And I think that's a significant challenge. But uncertainties in model predictions are a fact of life. And I would argue that if we ignore them and pretend they don't exist, we likely could do more harm than good. Let's see, time-wise. Okay, I can go over this real quick. This just shows the results of uncertainty analysis with the Apple model. And the black symbols is so on the y-axis, you have relative confidence interval width. So that's a percentage of the model predicted value. The black symbols are model parameter error, so the coefficients, assume certain uncertainties in that. And then the triangles are model input error. So you assume a 15% input error of all the input variables. And you can see that the contribution of the two sources of error vary depending on our land management practice. And why is that? Because depending on the land management practice, how phosphorus is applied, whether it's applied or not, is going to utilize different equations, which are different, have different sensitivities to the uncertainties and have different input variables. So we just started with some results, getting to actual model some of these sites at Kevin King's site. And this shows you our calculation of predicting runoff using the SCS curve number method. 2015 did an okay job in both sites. 2016 way over predicted, close to 5 inches of runoff when none was measured. And then in 2017 at both sites, again, over predicted. If we use those numbers into the Apple model, we see that for the 2015 and B1, we nailed it. But given that we didn't have a great prediction of runoff, sometimes you can get the right answer for the wrong reason in a model. But again, you can see other than that, we overpredict significantly, and that's due to overpredicting runoff. If we actually put in the measured runoff, which is one of the advantages of using Apple, is you can put in measured values because it doesn't calculate them. We do them, as would be expected, we do a much better job in 2 of the 3 years. But in 2015 at both these sites, it's telling us that there's some issues or things in the model that we haven't yet accounted for. And again, that's what this work is going to be doing. So with that, I just want to thank again SPA for this forum and OCP North America for their generous support along with my agency.
Great, thank you, John. You may have noticed I put up a lake behind me. I see all these great water backgrounds I've been seeing all day, so I wanted to put mine up for a little while to compete with Carl's there. So now,
yeah, I'm sitting on the Rocky Mountains right now.
Well, I am actually sitting near the lake in my background, which is Flathead Lake in Montana. So anyway, so let's go on. Actually, we have some questions for Carl and Barrett regarding the modeling efforts that they have underway. I think we can clearly see how they connect with, to John's earlier work, right? So having the ability to make good predictions about outputs of phosphorus from a catchment based on practices being applied is going to be very important in being able to scale up some of the intervention strategies we might have. So anybody have any questions?
Yeah, please use the raise hand feature and I can unmute you as you come through. I've also noticed for John Winston, there are a number of questions in the chat box, John, if you want to address those separately. But any questions now for Carl or Barrett? Just to remind you, if you click on your participants box, that raise hand feature is in your lower left of the box. We did get a chat question come in, so I'll just go ahead and read that since they're not using the raise hand. Is there a project comparing many different models? Carol.
Actually, so I think I just ran across there was a multi-modeling effort in the Western Lake Erie Basin by some of the people in this group. Yeah, if whoever asked that question, I could dig that up and send it to them. We've done a comparison between Apple and Tibet, and with Apple, Tibet, and phosphorus indices in the South. You know, there are a few studies out there looking, but you know, the problem is some of these models are so difficult to run. All the effort it takes to run through it, and then asking another, basically you have to probably have another group run a different type of model. And again, sometimes what do you mean by a different model? So sometimes it might be a completely separate model, or it might be the same model, but using different sets of parameters. So what's often termed equifinality, meaning you could use the same model, different sets of parameters, and come up with the same output and the same ability to predict a certain data set. But if you use those two models with the different parameter sets to predict something in the future, you get completely different answers. So one of the issues we have with models.